Hey Unwrappers, Ollie here. Just a quick word before this episode begins about The Week magazine. It is an open-minded selection of reporting and analysis distilled from more than 200 global news sources each and every week. Readers can discover the biggest stories of the week, but also, just like here on the pod, an eclectic mix of the best art, food, culture and entertainment stories as well. And just for being a listener to this podcast, you can get your first 6 issues of The Week magazine for free, along with a welcome gift of a thermal mug. Whoop! Just visit theweek.co.uk/offer and enter the promo code POD21. That is POD21 at theweek.co.uk/offer. And now, on with the show. It's the week ending Saturday the 13th of March, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen England's children returning to classrooms after 2 months of homeschooling, the broadcast of Harry and Meghan's bombshell interview with Oprah Winfrey, and the nominations announced for the BAFTA Film Awards, with 16 of 24 acting nominees coming from ethnic minorities. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from The Week magazine is editor Theo Tait, from The Week junior editor Felicity Capon, and not an editor yet, but hey, she's freelance, she edits her life. It's journalist Suchandrika Chakrabarti. Felicity, you are starting the show this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
I think this week will be remembered for explosive revelations about a paradise lost.
This was the biggest mistake made during the French atmospheric nuclear testing program. You had a test who, instead of going in a direction where it would have impacted very few people, actually you had the radioactive cloud traveling towards the most populated island in Polynesia.
Princeton University lecturer, scientist Sébastien Philippe, speaking to Euronews on Tuesday. So, Felicity, Arian brought us some nuclear news last week. This is becoming a regular slot now. What's the nuclear news this week?
Well, the news is, going back to 1960s and 1970s, France carried out nuclear testing on French Polynesia. There are about 193 nuclear tests between 1966 to 1996. It was sort of known that these exposed the local population, site workers, French soldiers, etc., to high levels of radiation.
And when you say on French Polynesia, you mean from the islands, but they weren't targeting Polynesia, it was just in their water, right?
Yeah, exactly. It was where they were carried out. A new report this week suggests that almost the entire overseas population could have been affected by the test, and this could open the way for tens of thousands of compensation claims against the French government. It's an online investigation conducted by a site called Disclose, and they've been analysing around 2,000 pages of French military documents which had been declassified in 2013.
2013? So why has it only emerged this week?
Well, it has been taken upon by Disclose and by other investigators to do this work themselves, and it seems very much like the French government have been trying to obfuscate or haven't been particularly helpful about trying to uncover this information. And the investigators have been looking at, they've conducted interviews, they've been looking at maps, they've been looking at photos. So they've been scanning all sorts of information and putting together different pieces of information to come up with the revelations that they have done. And
the new calculation they've done then, just to be clear, indicates that the radiation that the residents of French Polynesia were exposed to was higher than previously reported. But how much higher? You've talked about how much of the population were affected, but by how much?
So there was one bomb that went off, and about 11,000 victims of the test received radiation doses, which would have been 5 times higher the qualifying level for compensation. So that's one example. I think there's higher examples. They were tests. So there was one particular bomb that I can't remember the name of, but the cloud was predicted to head north and was supposed to reach a height of 9,000 meters, but it stayed much lower and in fact was blown over towards Tahiti, where no precautions had been taken to protect the population there. So there were all sorts of things that sort of went wrong that they hadn't calculated at all. And that means that far more people have been impacted, which is only sort of coming to light now.
Well, if they did go wrong, Theo, I mean, it's tempting to look back on this and think, rather than what that scientist chap was saying in that clip we just played, that this was a mistake. Obviously, it wasn't intentional to poison people with radiation, but maybe they didn't really care and they just didn't think about what happened to the Tahitians in 1960, whatever.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think France was a colonial nation, and like other nuclear nations, they tended to test their nuclear weapons in places very, very far away from their own territorial nation and in the lands of indigenous people. I mean, this is what Britain did as well in Australia and also later on in the Pacific.
Yeah, and the Americans in Micronesia. I mean, I do wonder, Suchandrika, whether this is just the beginning of similar scandals that are going to... I'm choosing metaphors that don't involve the word erupt, but they keep coming to my mind, that are going to explode, that are going to happen across the world.
So you already know with France that there were 17 nuclear tests in the Algerian Sahara, and that's not been included in this particular investigation. They've not had any apologies, they've not been sort of bundled in with the others and had the same levels of compensation or acknowledgement. So obviously that's going to be another area where the researchers are going to look at and decide that the people affected by those tests deserve some level of compensation or support.
Let's talk about compensation then. So the people that are entitled to compensation, Felicity, aren't all getting it. Is that right?
Yeah, so, I mean, there were widespread concerns at the time, and the concerns have been there ever since, really. And France only set up a compensation board in 2010 for civilian and military victims. And claimants, in theory, only had to prove that they lived in French Polynesia at the time and had contracted one of 23 cancers recognised as resulting from radiation in order to receive a payout. But the board has actually only so far paid compensation to around 400 people, and that's only 63 local inhabitants. And sort of most shockingly, they've rejected more than 80% of claims, and they haven't had to justify why they've rejected these claims. And a lot of people have just given up trying to be compensated. But I mean, Theo's quite right to point out that this isn't just France. So between 1946 and 1996, more than 2,000 nuclear weapons tests were conducted by the US, the UK, the Soviet Union, France and China. And of course, these took place in locations selected on the basis of colonial history and on the lands belonging to indigenous people.
I mean, your first thought obviously is to feel awful for any human being that's had a health implication from this. But Felicity, during that period when you were allowed to test nuclear bombs underground even, I mean, this kind of set of statistics makes you think about what that might have been doing to the environment.
Yeah, exactly. And as I was saying before, these are lands that belong to indigenous people who are really sort of heavily connected to the land and understand it in all sorts of ways. And it's quite right that sort of nuclear waste stays on much longer than, these huge bombs that go off sort of in an instant, but the fallout from them lasts for decades and, impacts the environment in all sorts of ways. I mean, there are other things that the way they were so sort of recklessly conducted. There was one example of British testing in Australian territory where even the kind of signs they were putting up sort of warning local people, they didn't understand the English, so it wasn't even in the right language. So there's all sorts of problems that would have come from this.
And actually, Suchandrika, it's not just civilians, is it? I mean, obviously, you sort of leap first to feeling sorry for civilians, but for military personnel even, even the people involved in testing the weapons themselves might not have realised the likelihood that they were going to get a cancer as a result of doing it that now seems apparent.
Yeah, absolutely. It just has long-term, multi-generational implications for anyone involved in all these tests. So where we are now, nuclear tests have changed, but they've never really stopped. It's a great Wired article. And basically, there's still our nuclear tests the US are doing, but it's with the lasers, so it's kind of virtual. And yes, as Theo mentioned, it kind of goes beyond my comprehension there. But it's just really interesting that what we have is kind of the old Cold War powers were the ones who were involved in all this testing. But now we have kind of the new powers that are coming up, the ones that are trying to gain power. So India, Pakistan and North Korea are the only countries that have conducted explosive nuclear tests since the ban was signed 25 years ago. So it's a question of, we've had this in the past and we're now seeing the problems that occur as a result. What's going to happen in the future? Are these other countries going to take it further? And if so, do we get back into a new Cold War arms race what's going to happen next.
And also, I guess, Theo, whether there needs to be, as there is an international agreement about not testing, whether there needs to be an international agreement about what compensation is appropriate when we know that this is the result of it.
I just think that, that if at the moment, if you're detonating a bomb, you're so far beyond the reach of any kind of international law that's not, you're going to get North Korea to sign up to that. You're going to get Pakistan and India who, regard each other as dangerous enemies and so feel that they need to protect themselves. I just think it's, as it was for us in the Cold War, it was presumably just a very, very long way down people's list of priorities.
And even on this story, it's still the case that France's National Institute of Health and Medical Research, they published a report last month saying that there was no certainty that there were any health consequences of the test. So they're still burying their head under the sand. It still hasn't got to the point where we can talk about what the compensation should be when they're still denying that there's a real certain link between the two. So I feel like we're a long way away from having conversations about what the compensation should be, because we're still trying to establish that there actually is a causal link.
And I guess trying to establish that there's been a cover-up. But let's say there has been a cover-up. What would you think has motivated that primarily? Is it saving face internationally, having done such a terrible thing, or is it financial? They don't want to pay out that money to people.
I don't know. I really don't know. Yes, it does seem now that, all the headlines are sort of running with this figure of exposing themselves to tens of thousands of compensation claims. I imagine no one really wants to deal with that, really. Yeah. So I imagine that if there is a way of sort of swerving and shifting from the blame to avoid all these compensation claims, which are now going to come out of the woodwork, you would think that they would do it.
I would think historically it's probably just a mixture of colonial arrogance and traditional military secrecy, isn't it? That these things are always kept secret. And it starts off being for national security, but that extends to cover a multitude of sins.
Well, and if that's true, then does it actually hurt the reputation of a country like France? Are they able to say, well, it was so long ago, even though the cover-up is much more recent, it was so long ago that, we wouldn't be doing that kind of thing now, so that doesn't affect our standing telling other countries what to do with their nuclear weapons?
Well, I think they can say, well, we signed up to the various test ban treaties, and this is all from a long time ago, it's very awful, etc., etc., here's a bit of money. Isn't that what people usually do in these situations? You
can imagine India and Pakistan feeling quite differently about that, can't you, Suchandrika?
Yeah, it just seems like it could get really quite scary if those countries kind of feel like, the US is carrying on with these nuclear tests with lasers, why don't we just carry on? It seems as though, is the West kind of setting itself up as a model of what to do with these weapons or not? And either way, what will that mean for the rest of the world?
Felicity, where do you see it going next?
I think it's going to open the way to more and more compensation claims. I think, as we were talking about at the beginning, France isn't the only country. There are so many places around the world where these tests have been carried out, and I would have thought that more and more compensation claims now come to governments who are going to have to pay out large sums of money, which is only right. I don't know what it means for how we feel about nuclear generally. I'm just aware, obviously, that it's 10 years since Fukushima in Japan, which obviously wasn't nuclear weapons testing, but it was nuclear, and there was a UN report, I think, that's come out this week about radiation caused by the nuclear meltdown there, and that's sort of saying that it hasn't damaged the health of local people, but there is still a lot of fear about that. And obviously Fukushima had a huge impact on Japanese people and how we think about nuclear more generally. So as part of a wider conversation about what we think about nuclear power, I think it could have important ramifications, certainly.
Yeah, and the suggestion here is we might have to wait another 6 decades before we really find out. Theo, I'm coming to you next after this. All right, Theo, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Was this the week when industry woke up to the great COVID exodus?
In line with ending free movement, there will be no immigration route for lower skilled workers. No longer will employers be able to rely on cut-price EU workers. Instead, we are calling on them rightly to invest in British people, as well as investing in technology skills to improve productivity and to join the UK government's mission to level up on skills, economic growth across our country. And these changes are vital if we are to deliver a high-skill, high-wage and highly productive economy by providing certainty on the new immigration system, and the economy and businesses have also had time to adjust.
Home Secretary Priti Patel laying out the UK's new points-based immigration system last February. Theo, it's been a year since that. but I think it's fair to say an unrepresentative year, not what the government was predicting. What's been the effect?
What this story is about is that for years the Tories have tried to restrict immigration, particularly EU immigration. We had the hostile environment, we had the points-based immigration system last year, and we had David Cameron's trying to reduce it all to the tens of thousands. But what really has sent immigration into reverse in a massive way is COVID. The figures suggest that last year the UK's foreign-born population dropped by 1 million. We don't produce reliable migration statistics at the best of times, but during the pandemic, they've gone completely out the window, so we don't really know. The estimates are somewhere between, at the upper end, it could be 1.3 million, at the bottom, it's probably something like 600,000. Either way, it's absolutely massive. The largest annual fall in population since World War II.
And why do you tie that to COVID when, as I said, I mean, it was a year ago that they introduced the points-based immigration system, so was it a combination of the both, or is it clearly COVID rather than what the government was trying to do?
I think it has to be COVID, because it's not only has it reduced immigration, it's sent it backwards into a very long way. And I think it's pretty obvious that the Brexit is part of it, but COVID is the main thing. The UK was one of the worst hit countries in the world, both health-wise and economically. And the sectors that were hit by it tend to employ lots of foreign workers, so hospitality, retail, transport, manufacturing, those sorts of things. And recent migrants also tend to live in rented accommodation. So the situation I think that a lot of people were left in, and this is, immigrant groups and stuff have confirmed this, is that you're in London or wherever and you're in, rented accommodation, your job is either furloughed or lost altogether. So you think, well, I might as well go home. What am I going to gain by being here?
So I suppose the question, Suchandrika, is whether this is a long-term trend or whether some of these people, I mean, obviously some of these people are going to come back, but a question of how many, whether being home, they might just decide to stay there, or whether when hospitality opens up again and people are needed to work in hotels and in restaurants, then immigrants are going to come to Britain because there are jobs.
Yeah, it's a good question, isn't it? Firstly, I think it depends, certainly in big cities like London, on what rental prices look like to begin with. So if foreign workers can come back to London and big cities like that and find jobs that allow them to put down deposits on flats to afford rent for the next 6 months or a year, then they might think about coming back and seeing it as worth doing, like a better quality of life than they have at home. Or they might not. They might decide that it's still too soon. Also, so for the first time since 1976, we had more people die than were born in the UK, and so it looks like we're going to have a real shortfall of young people who want to do those kinds of transient jobs while they're young, come over to the UK and have that kind of life experience, and so we're going to see that shortfall. And again, would people look at the UK and think, it doesn't seem like much fun to come here and do those essential jobs anymore? Yeah, it might really change what the UK's image is to those foreign workers who've left. They might decide it's not really worth it.
And that is often pinned on Brexit, Felicity, isn't it? Never mind COVID. The idea that Britain now doesn't seem like such a welcoming place for immigrant workers. But I'd argue that reached a peak around the time of the referendum itself, not necessarily now. I mean, it's been 5 years. Surely if you were going to not work in Britain because you felt it wasn't a welcoming place, if you're Polish or Bulgarian or whatever, you've got that out of your system by this point.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I agree with what Theo's saying. I think obviously Brexit plays a part in this, but I think it's overshadowed by the pandemic to such a huge extent, really. The Financial Times did a really good piece on this. They were sort of examining various places around the UK where you can really see the exodus quite acutely. And so one of the places is Preston, which had a big wave of immigration from Eastern European countries like Bulgaria. And actually, when they were interviewing these people, they were saying, the pandemic and the ensuing lockdown has been so bad that people wanted to go back to their families and go and see their families. So that seemed to be a really a driving factor. And it's just interesting because I think the FT was sort of musing about what these places could look like if the exodus continues and if it is sustained. So somewhere like Preston, for example, you had Catholic churches which were on the brink of closure suddenly acquiring a new younger congregations. You had Polish priests, you had schools swelling, different kinds of pubs, takeaway shops, bringing it, and these places, potentially could change it if the exodus is sustaining. But I mean, I think it has to be the COVID and it has to be the pandemic. And I think the UK's response has been so appalling. We are, in terms of the death toll, in terms of how harsh the lockdown has been, that there's absolutely no way that this couldn't be COVID. We will be seeing the effects of this for such a long time to come.
Well, unless, Theo, the government response now in terms of the vaccine is able to turn that around. I mean, yes, you can see that the response in 2020 was poor by the standards of other European countries, but we might end up being the safest place to come and work, having been the unsafest.
Yeah, absolutely. We might, and we hope that we'll have a brilliant bounce back recovery. The old V-shaped one, slightly delayed, but happening. But the thing is that if we do have a recovery like that, and if suddenly hospitality opens up again, and all these sectors open up again in a big way, we're going to probably need quite a lot more workers than we've got on tap at the moment.
And that's the significance of this, is it? Is what it could do to the economy if those workers aren't there.
Well, I think that, in the short term, it's probably not particularly negative, because it means that there are fewer people around, that rental prices are cheaper, as Suchandrika was saying. We've got high unemployment anyway, so why would we need extra workers? So that's true. In the moment, it's not particularly awful. I mean, the one particular point about Brexit is that if you're an EU national and you didn't have settled status before the end of the year, if you've gone back under COVID, then you won't be able to get back in. So, or at least you will, but you'll have to apply through the new points-based system. So it's just, we're suddenly going to find that all these key industries that rely a lot on foreign workers, like construction, hospitality, social care, they're going to struggle to find people.
Well, unless we make it easier for them to come back, Suchandrika. I mean, that was the whole argument for Brexit, wasn't it? Is that rather than the EU controlling our immigration policy, we can, and that would include the possibility to have incentives for foreign workers to come here when we need them.
Yeah, absolutely. So looking at the UK Community Renewal Fund and how that's going to work, there's going to be lots more investment, we could be matching EU receipts throughout the UK with the Shared Prosperity Fund, and all these different funds have been drawn up in a document that's on the government website. It's been written up by Robert Jenrick, the Housing Minister, and he says at the bottom, this is a real opportunity to help build the safer, greener, more prosperous and neighbourly country that we want to see after COVID. And I think the word neighbourly is really interesting and is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. What does he mean by the term neighbourly? Does neighbourly mean seeing a country that has fewer foreign workers, but all the British people are sort of putting together? Or is it a case that we're neighbourly to neighbouring countries and we're going to invite them back and say, actually, we really need you? So I think that is not very clear in amongst all the numbers and all the kind of, there's hope, there'll be hope for the future.
And if there is a drive, Felicity, to welcome back more immigrant workers, how do you think that might go down with all those people who voted for Brexit? And, as recently as winter 2019 voted for Boris Johnson to deliver Brexit, because clearly one of the drivers there was to bring immigration down as well as control the numbers. What that really meant was people saying, I feel there are too many immigrants here.
Well, I mean, it's always been such an emotive issue in this country, hasn't it? I mean, there's always such sort of fierce debate around this topic, and rightly so. No matter what happens, it will continue to be so. It sort of seems woven into the identity of this country. But I suppose part of the argument has to be, do we need to wean ourselves off dependence on cheap foreign labour in some industries? And does there need to be more emphasis on training domestic workers in the skill sets that we need, so that, if there is a shortage post-COVID, if we are trying to get out the economy roaring back to life, do we actually need to be training people in the skills that we will be missing? I mean, that's also something that I think is probably quite popular with a lot of voters and probably needs to be factored into it. The only other thing I would say, I suppose, is post-budget, there's been this big row about the 1% pay rise for NHS workers, and I think that's the NHS again, another industry that relies heavily on immigrant workers, and this big sort of feeling that this pay rise isn't good enough, and the government retorting saying that they just don't have the money after the effects of lockdown. But I do wonder whether that's another reason why that you'll see more people leaving the NHS because they're not being paid what they should be.
So is that the only way to reverse the reliance on immigrant workers, Theo? To put money up? And that seems something that the government aren't prepared to do. It's not just about training, is it? It's about making sure the salary's there.
Yeah, I think it's not just the government. It's employers generally have been used to having a quite a large pool of cheap foreign labour, and they've relied on it for a long time. And in many ways, it's been brilliant for our economy. But at the moment, definitely the government has no intention of it may change its tune later on, but it has no intention of loosening the rules. Its position is that the businesses need to concentrate on developing the skills of domestic workers to fill shortages as the economy grows, and also to invest in automation and productivity measures generally, which is all, I suppose, great, except that these are difficult long-term projects, and we may find that we haven't got the ability to do that. But we don't want people who aren't prepared to pick daffodils or potatoes or work in fish factories for the money that is currently being offered.
Do you think it's just about money, Suchandrika, or is there a cultural thing as well, a sense of people's self-worth? I mean, it seems to me that there is an appeal of working in the construction industry, for example. You know, certain type of people love working with diggers and concrete mixers and building things, but picking potatoes just doesn't appeal to British people. It's very hard to find someone at school who says, when I grow up, I want to dig potatoes for a living. And I'm not sure the salary would make a difference to that.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Like, I'm definitely old enough to remember Tony Blair's 50% of everyone will be going to university, because I was kind of that generation. And we still have this idea that there are certain jobs that are worth doing and certain jobs are of certain classes. And we do seem to have outsourced our kind of literal working classes in sweating and bending down and picking things out of the ground work, which I've never done. I don't know if anyone here has done that kind of work. I've certainly never done it.
Look at these hands. You know I haven't.
There we go. So I've been sitting down on Zoom for far too long. So yeah, we have outsourced these kind of jobs to people from other countries. And like just going sort of one maybe salary band above that, the kind of jobs that Felicity mentioned in the NHS, you know, kind of care home workers and nurses. And again, these are really hands-on physical jobs, and they've got like a higher skill set level. But again, we've kind of outsourced these jobs to agencies, and we've had people coming from across the globe to come and work in this country. And so now, if firstly we have barriers to them entering the country, they're obviously not going to come back. Having said all of that, last week a series of jobs were added to the shortage occupations list, and they include things like senior care workers, nursing assistants, pharmacists, foreign language teachers, which seems really positive. And so it's going to be easier for those people to get visas to come back as long as they've got a job offer and a salary of 20k plus. So it seems like some of this is being taken on board by the government, but that is not a very long list. That's not a huge number of changes, and it's just worth seeing if the government will add more to that list. We'll see that it's worth trying to invite people back, because the cultural change in this country is going to take much more time than we have to have that kind of positive economic change.
Okay, so Chandrika, you're up next after this. All right, so Chandrika, you are finishing the show this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
So was this the week we saw renters become more powerful?
Workers in their 20s aren't turning to Zillow or other real estate sites to find their next apartment. They're going on TikTok. Yes, TikTok. Brokers are using the popular video sharing app to show off apartments to prospective tenants. The app's algorithm suggests videos that are tailored to the user's preferences and interests. Established rental brand StreetEasy has even created an account themselves.
ABC7 Eyewitness News, New York, reporting the increase in people using TikTok to find their next apartment there. Is this the future, Suchandrika? Another story where you've made us all look at another app.
Let's not go too big on TikTok, although I think we all agreed earlier that it is the future and we're all on it, and we should say our handles at the end of this. At Suchandrika, guys. No. So yeah, it's more than just an app, although the app element is important. We'll get into that in a minute. But, you know, as we just mentioned with Theo's story, people are leaving big cities. People are leaving countries like the UK, countries that people would flock to a couple of years ago. The promise of money, all kinds of jobs, social lives, access to great culture. All of that has kind of become a moot point in the last year, and it's made people rethink what they want from their lives. Do they want space and gardens and access to the countryside? Maybe. So we've seen rents fall in big cities because landlords can't rent out those properties. In London, demand for rented properties is down 43%, which is, you know, nearly half. That's huge.
Okay, so what's happened this week?
This week, we found that 20-somethings have kind of got their pick of apartments in the centre of big cities like New York and London. And they're looking towards places like TikTok and other apps to have quick video tours of apartments. And estate agents are making the most of that and moving onto these apps and showing off what they've got on offer.
Okay. So, I mean, estate agents adapt their platforms for what Gen Z expects. Is that a surprising story? Is it any different to millennials, having found Zoopla? Or is something different happening?
So I found a guide to using TikTok to find your next apartment, and it is a little bit different to using Zillow or Zoopla and Rightmove, which we have here in the UK. So the algorithm curates the content you see based on your viewing habits. So if you think, right, I've got to move, or I want to move somewhere more exciting. Downtown Manhattan's suddenly more affordable for me since lots of people have moved out. You start looking for apartments, and then TikTok will start offering you up more apartments based on your viewing habits, more tours around empty apartments. You can use popular hashtags like hashtag realtors of TikTok and hashtag apartments London if you're in London. And then you can find more and more apartments because of that. And once you found these searches and you start following realtors and estate agents, you could be served up more. But also, more important than all of that, I think, is that you're encouraged to comment on these apartments while you're looking around them. And that means renters can find each other and start saying to each other, hey, have you actually seen there's a problem with this apartment, or there's a problem with this landlord, or I had a bad experience? And for me, that gives the renters a lot of power.
Ah, yes. I mean, that is a change, isn't it, Felicity? Where do you think that could lead?
I think it seems really positive. I think the idea of having a landlord rating apps is a good idea, similar to the ways that you can see that with other things like Airbnb. You sort of live or die by the reviews. And I was just doing a little bit of research before this, and there's already an app for this in New York called Open Igloo, which is a landlord rating app. It's different from Yelp. I think Yelp, you sort of could write entire paragraphs about how aggrieved you are, whereas this, I think, is a bit sort of a more slick and succinct rating on various different things, pollution, pest control, all that sort of thing. But it just seems that it would introduce more transparency into the process in general. I think whether you're renting or buying, the power has long been in the hands of, well, to me, it seems the power has long been in the hands of either the landlords or the estate agents, really kind of opaque processes where you never quite know what's going on. So anything that slightly adjusts that shift, I think, could potentially be a positive thing.
But landlords and realtors, Theo, set the price based on what they know the market will pay. I mean, they're a business, right? So however much noise there is on social media of people saying that's an outrageous sized bathroom and look at the state of that kitchen, I wouldn't rent from that guy, he'd left a ladder, lent up the wrong door. They obviously can, because that's how they've set the price. Does it make any difference, really, to the fact that they will find people to occupy their vacancies?
Well, I think if you get a bit more consumer power, then it's not just going to be a question of like square footage and supply and demand, is it? It's because some people will go up the special algorithmically curated thing and will be pointed to you, I suppose. Which sounds quite good, doesn't it?
Well, that's interesting, isn't it, Suchandrika? Do you get the kind of have and have-nots? The people who are familiar with whatever the latest app is to find out the gossip on, the role of the landlord, and the people who don't have access to that information might as well just be looking through a copy of Loot like I was in 1999 when I found my first flat.
There you go. Yeah, exactly. You'll get this kind of slight generational in quotation marks, half generational difference between how people are looking for these apartments, the kind of information they have access to, and indeed, like the estate agents, what kind of, are they happy using these platforms? And when I say happy, I mean, do they use them well? Because if an estate agent can't use them well, then the apartments that they are agenting on behalf of won't appear on these apps. And so the quote-unquote best apartments might not be available on TikTok or whichever other social media you're on. Having said that, I've seen quotes from like New York realtors saying that they've moved a quarter of their business onto TikTok, or all of it during the pandemic, and they found sort of new renters that way. So I guess it really depends on the areas that you're looking at, how cool they are, the other kind of buzz online about them, and how permanent the move away from these cities really are. Because I certainly talked about that a lot on this podcast, on this episode and before, about all these people leaving London, leaving places like New York, and not wanting to come back. But, the pandemic isn't over yet. This time next year, people might feel very differently, having spent a year out in the countryside and been perhaps very bored by it. So at the moment, we don't actually know what these changes are going to be, and people are rushing in to try and take advantage of a situation that's still changing.
And I suppose from a policy point of view, Theo, now, if we had a government that was inclined to do so, or local government that was inclined to do so, would be a time to force landlords a bit more radically to do things that, in other countries they do have to do. I mean, at the moment, there aren't that many restrictions on how you advertise a property compared to other big cities in London.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a conversation that should happen, isn't it? I mean, it's I think we are. It's a tough market there, particularly in the big cities, and and people are treated very badly, aren't they? I think it would be a very good thing if that happened.
I think in some ways it's a miracle that people even live in cities like London and New York. I mean, it's just so prohibitively expensive. And from, personal experience, the process of trying to find somewhere half decent to live can be so dispiriting, and it can make these big cities feel so hostile and so unwelcoming to so many people. I think it's so interesting that, again, back to the pandemic, but, so many young people in particular, once their leases come to an end, would have gone back to mum and dad to see it out there, because it's just, they might have been furloughed, they might have lost their jobs, or they might have just thought, I can save money if I go back to mum and dad. So, I've long thought that anything that kind of gets more renters talking to each other and getting a bit more power back into their hands would be a good thing. And I suppose the other thing that we should just mention is the rent debt crisis going on at the moment, that I really think that so many people falling into arrears and not being able to pay their rents, which I think is something that the government is going to have to address. But yeah, to me it's always just seemed like a small miracle that anyone can survive in these big cities.
I wonder as well if a knock-on effect of people sharing their potential rentals on social media, Suchandrika, is that you end up with a slight uniformity of interior design. I mean, we've seen this in Airbnb, haven't we? Wherever you go in the world, every apartment looks the same, whether you're in Venice or Houston, because they know what people like on the internet and what looks good.
Well, that depends on how much money landlords have left over to spend on interior design, because there's another element to this whole situation, which is that, according to Savills, house prices are set to boom over the next 5 years in the UK, which is an absolutely fascinating thing, because we've just talked about rents dropping and it being hard to find renters, and usually people are not buying property to live in multiple properties that much. They're buy-to-let owners, aren't they? And so Savills reckons that property prices in prime central London are forecast to rebound strongly, rising 3% in this year, interesting, 7% next year, and a total of 21.6% by 2025.
But I mean, that's a complete reversal of what the estate agents predicted about 18 months ago, isn't it?
It's interesting, isn't it? And on both sides of why they're predicting this. On the one hand, again, we're still in a pandemic. It's so hard to know what people are going to choose to do. And secondly, if it's a kind of image thing, don't worry about the property that you own, it's going to be okay, then again, how do they know that? Because one of the main sources of income for landlords will be renters. And if they're not up for it, what a landlord's going to do, and also if they're not going to pay those levels of rent that they used to get in 2019, but they've still got the mortgage to pay for the landlords, what the landlord's going to do. So we're at the either storm in terms of change, and it's hard to know which way it's going to go. On the one hand, a rent's going to stay low. On the other hand, a house price is really going to go up that far, over 20% in the next 4 years. So also play for, it seems.
Well, Suchandrika, that was a well-presented view of great appeal to young professionals and well within my budget. That is it for this week. My thanks to Suchandrika, Theo and Felicity. You can subscribe to this show for free. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, you can claim your first 6 issues of The Week magazine now for free, along with a welcome gift, by visiting theweek.co.uk/offer and entering the promo code POD21. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.